6 months had passed since the day the sky burned over New Eden, and the galaxy watched humanity with curious eyes, expecting tears and surrender and pleas for help. But what they saw instead was silence. And silence from humans made the older and wiser species very nervous indeed. The Galactic Concord sent ambassadors to Earth with offers of mediated peace talks. And they spoke of reparations and treaties and putting the unfortunate incident behind everyone. And they used soft words like healing and moving forward, as if 890 million murdered innocents could be balanced with credits and apologies. Chancellor Webb received these ambassadors with perfect courtesy and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And he thanked them for their concern and assured them that humanity would handle the matter internally. And when they pressed him for details, he simply said that humanity needed time to grieve. And they left confused but satisfied that the humans were behaving as expected. But behind closed doors, in underground bunkers and hidden stations scattered across human space, something else was happening, something the galaxy could not see and would not suspect until it was far too late. And this something had a name that would become legend: Project Prometheus. Project Prometheus was not a single plan, but 100 plans woven together like threads in a tapestry of revenge. And every branch of human society contributed to its creation. And for the first time in their history, humans worked together with perfect unity and absolute purpose. In asteroid fields far from prying eyes, shipyards operated around the clock as workers built warships faster than anyone thought possible. And these were not ordinary vessels, but killing machines designed with one purpose only. And 400 new ships took shape in the darkness while the galaxy believed humanity was weeping. Admiral Tanaka oversaw the military preparations with cold precision, and she had not slept more than 4 hours a night since walking through the ruins of New Eden. And the faces of dead children haunted her dreams. But she did not seek peace from these nightmares, for she used them as fuel for the fire that burned in her heart. Veterans came out of retirement by the thousands, and young people lined up at recruitment centers with determination in their eyes. And the human military swelled to a size it had never reached before. And every soldier trained with a focus and intensity that impressed even the most hardened instructors. But humanity knew that guns and ships alone would not be enough. And so they deployed weapons that no one expected, money and information and whispered words in the right ears. Human corporations had spent centuries building trade relationships across the galaxy. And now these connections became weapons more powerful than any cannon, and quietly, secretly, human businesses began purchasing majority shares in companies that supplied the Volthori Dominion with everything they needed to survive: fuel suppliers and food importers and rare metal refineries. One by one they fell under human control without anyone noticing. And the executives smiled and signed contracts and had no idea that they were handing humanity the keys to the Volthori economy. Meanwhile, the best hackers and intelligence agents humanity had ever produced went to work on the Volthori networks. And they were patient and careful, and left no traces as they slipped through digital defenses like ghosts. And within months, they had mapped every military installation and every supply line and every secret the Dominion tried to hide. Commander Elias Okonkwo led a black operations team that operated in the shadows between stars. And this man was tall and strong with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. And he had lost his sister on Kepler's Hope and carried her memory like a torch in the darkness. His team captured a Volthori general named Krathvos during a raid on a border outpost. And they brought him to a secret facility where the lights were bright and the questions were endless. And eventually, the general spoke, because everyone speaks in the end. What Krathvos revealed turned cold anger into something deeper and more terrible. For the cleansing protocol was only the beginning. Just the first phase of a plan to exterminate humanity entirely. And the Volthori High Command had already approved the second phase. a final assault on Earth itself that would wipe humans from existence. Commander Okonkwo delivered this intelligence to Chancellor Webb personally, and the two men sat in silence for a long time before the Chancellor spoke. And his voice was soft, but it carried the weight of worlds. "They mean to kill us all," Webb said, and it was not a question but a statement of simple fact. Every man, woman, and child erased from the universe as if we never existed. "Yes, sir," Okonkwo replied. "They believe we are too dangerous to let live." Webb laughed then, a sound without humor that echoed in the quiet room, and he shook his head slowly as he considered the bitter irony of it all. "They feared what we might become," he said, "and now they have guaranteed that we will become exactly what they feared. For we will not simply defeat them, Commander. We will erase them as they plan to erase us." Human ambassadors traveled to every corner of the Concord, visiting species that the Velthari had wronged over the centuries, and there were many such species. For the Dominion had left a trail of broken treaties and stolen worlds across the galaxy. And humanity offered friendship and trade, and something even more valuable: the promise of justice. Seeds of alliance were planted in fertile soil, and they would bloom at exactly the right moment. And the Velthari had no idea that their victims were gathering in the shadows, united by a common enemy and led by a species that had turned grief into steel. Far away in her palace, Empress Syraketh received reports that human space had gone strangely quiet, that their military seemed smaller than before, and their economy appeared to be struggling. And she took this as proof that her cleansing protocol had worked perfectly. Her eldest advisor, an ancient Velthari named Koroth, who had survived 3 emperors, came to her with worry in his eyes and caution in his words. "Empress," he said with a respectful bow, "I have studied the humans for many years, and this silence troubles me greatly." "Why should silence trouble you, old one?" The Empress laughed. "They are broken and afraid, exactly as we intended." Koroth shook his head slowly, and his voice carried the wisdom of centuries when he spoke again. "Empress, when humans go quiet, wise species begin to worry," he warned. "They are not a people who accept defeat. They are a people who plan. And I fear that their silence is not submission, but preparation." The Empress dismissed him with a wave of her clawed hand, for she was young in the ways of her kind and proud of her victory, and she could not imagine that the soft humans could pose any real threat to her mighty empire. She would remember Koroth's warning soon, and she would wish with all her heart that she had listened, but by then it would be far too late for wishes to matter. The year was 2347, and humanity had spread across the stars like seeds carried by the wind. And 12 beautiful colony worlds now carried the laughter of human children and the dreams of human hearts. For 300 years, humans had reached outward from their blue marble called Earth. And they had done so not with weapons drawn, but with hands extended in friendship. And the galaxy had mostly welcomed them, for humans were curious and kind and eager to trade and learn and grow. The Galactic Concord was a great assembly of over 200 species, and humanity had joined this alliance with enthusiasm and hope. And they had built trade routes and cultural exchanges and scientific partnerships that benefited all who participated. And the future seemed bright and full of promise. But not everyone looked upon humanity with friendly eyes. And in the dark regions beyond the Concord's borders lurked the Velthari Dominion, a proud and ancient empire of reptilian warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds through blood and fire. And they watched humanity's rapid growth with jealousy and hatred burning in their cold hearts. The Velthari had ruled their corner of space for 10,000 years, and they believed themselves superior to all other life forms. And the sight of these young and soft humans spreading so quickly filled them with rage. For how dare these newcomers thrive while the mighty Velthari remained confined to their borders? Empress Syraketh sat upon her throne of black stone and listened to her generals speak of the human threat. and her golden eyes narrowed with cruel intent as she gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. And she called it the Cleansing Protocol, and she smiled as she spoke those terrible words. On a peaceful morning on the colony world of New Eden, a little girl named Sarah was playing in her garden while her mother prepared breakfast. And the sky was blue, and the birds were singing, and everything seemed perfect and safe. And then the sky turned to fire. The Valkyrie fleet had come without warning and without mercy, and their weapons rained down upon New Eden like the anger of vengeful gods. And buildings crumbled and forests burned, and people screamed as their world was torn apart around them. And Sarah's mother grabbed her and ran, but there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Prosperity fell next, and then Kepler's hope. And in just 72 hours, 3 human worlds had been reduced to ash and ruin, and 890 million innocent souls had perished in the flames. And the Valkyrie were not satisfied with simple death, for they deployed biological weapons designed specifically to target human DNA. And those who survived the initial bombardment died slowly and painfully as the poison ate them from within. The distress signals reached Earth in fragments, broken cries for help that cut off one by one into horrible silence. And when Admiral Yuki Tanaka arrived with the 7th Fleet, she found nothing but graveyards stretching from horizon to horizon. And she walked through the ruins of New Eden and saw the bodies of children still clutching their toys. And something inside her turned to ice and then to iron. Admiral Tanaka was a woman of 53 years who had served humanity with honor and distinction. And she had seen conflict before, but nothing like this. Nothing so cruel and so complete. And she ordered her crew to document everything. Every body, and every burned home, and every shattered dream. And she broadcast these images across all of human space so that every man and woman and child could see what had been done to their brothers and sisters. The reaction was immediate and unified in a way that humanity had never experienced before. And there were no political divisions anymore, and no arguments about resources or territory. For every human heart beat with the same rhythm of grief and the same pulse of rage. And billions of voices rose together in a cry that echoed through the stars. Chancellor Marcus Webb stood before the United Earth Council. And this man, who had spent his life seeking peaceful solutions and diplomatic compromises, now spoke words that carried the weight of steel. And his voice did not waver as he addressed not just the council, but all of humanity. "They came for us without warning," he said, and his eyes were hard as diamonds. "They murdered our families while they slept. They poisoned our children and burned our homes. And they did this because they thought we were weak. Because they believed that our kindness was a flaw. And they wanted to teach humanity the meaning of fear." He paused and looked into the cameras that carried his image to every human world. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried the promise of thunder. "They were wrong," Chancellor Webb declared. "They have not taught us fear. For we are the species that crawled out of caves and conquered our own world. We are the species that split the atom and walked on moons and reached for the stars. And we do not break, we do not bow, and we do not forget." The council chamber erupted in cheers. Webb raised his hand for silence, and his final words would be remembered for centuries to come. "They wanted to teach humanity fear," he said. "Instead, they have awakened something far worse. For we will not simply fight back. We will not simply defend ourselves. We will show the galaxy what happens when humanity stops being merciful. And the Valkyrie Dominion will learn that some lessons cannot be unlearned." Far away in her palace of obsidian and gold, Empress Cyriceth celebrated her great victory with feasts and songs of triumph. And her generals assured her that the human threat had been eliminated, that these soft creatures would sue for peace and offer tribute and trouble the Dominion no more. She did not know that humans had a saying passed down through countless generations of struggle and survival. a simple phrase that captured something essential about their strange and wonderful species. And that saying was this: "We do not get sad, we get even." The Empress would learn the truth of those words soon enough, and the lesson would cost her everything she had ever known and everything she had ever loved. But on that night, she simply smiled and raised her glass and toasted to the death of humanity's spirit. She could not have been more wrong, for humanity's spirit was not dead, it was merely quiet. And the galaxy would soon discover that when humans go quiet, wise species begin to worry, and the Valkyrie were not wise at all. 1 year had passed since the murders of New Eden and Prosperity and Kepler's Hope, and the Valkyrie Dominion had gathered the largest fleet in its 10,000-year history, and 2,000 warships stood ready to launch the final assault on Earth and end the human threat forever. Empress Syraka stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Divine Vengeance, and she looked upon her assembled armada with pride swelling in her chest. And she imagined the terror the humans would feel when this wall of destruction appeared in their skies. "Tomorrow we launch," she announced to her generals, and her voice carried through every ship in the fleet. "Tomorrow we complete what we began. And the galaxy will remember forever that the Valkyrie Dominion does not leave enemies alive to seek revenge." Her officers cheered and raised their fists in salute, and the fleet hummed with anticipation like a predator preparing to strike. But none of them knew that far across the stars, humanity was ready for them, and the trap was about to spring. The first blow came not from weapons, but from silence, and it struck at midnight on the day before the Valkyrie fleet was set to launch. Across the Dominion, every corporation that humanity had secretly purchased issued the same order at the same moment: cease all shipments to Valkyrie space immediately. And cargo ships stopped in their tracks, and warehouses closed their doors, and the lifeblood of the Empire stopped flowing. The Valkyrie economy collapsed within hours as fuel reserves dropped to critical levels and food supplies ran short and factories ground to a halt. And the generals who had been so confident just hours before now scrambled to understand what was happening. But there was no time to recover, for the second blow fell like a hammer from the heavens. Human cyber warfare units, who had spent a year infiltrating every corner of the Valkyrie network, activated their final protocols, and in an instant, the entire military communication system went dark. And ships could not talk to ships, and planets could not warn planets, and the great fleet became 2,000 blind and deaf vessels floating in confusion. Admiral Tanaka watched from her command center as reports of success flooded in, and she allowed herself a small smile before turning to her communications officer with orders that would shake the galaxy. "Open a channel to the Galactic Concord," she commanded. "It is time for our friends to speak." Across the galaxy, 17 different species rose as one and denounced the Valkyrie Dominion before the entire Concord. And they presented evidence of war crimes and broken treaties and 100 years of cruelty that humanity's intelligence teams had gathered. And one by one, they announced that their borders were closed to the Valkyrie forever. The Dominion found itself suddenly alone, cut off from supplies and allies and support, surrounded by enemies who had waited generations for this moment of justice. And the Empress could only watch in horror as her empire crumbled around her. But the worst was yet to come, for humanity had not forgotten the faces of their dead, and they had built something terrible in the darkness of their grief. Admiral Tanaka's rebuilt armada emerged from slipspace at the edge of Valkyrie territory. And it was not the 400 ships that had been constructed in secret, but 600 vessels of war. For humanity had found allies who shared their hunger for vengeance. And together they formed a wall of steel and fire that stretched across the stars. The Admiral stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Remembrance, and she thought of the little girl named Sarah, whose body she had found on New Eden, still clutching a stuffed bear that had been burned black by Valkyrie weapons. And she let that memory fill her heart as she gave the order to broadcast. Empress Cyreketh. Admiral Tanaka's voice echoed through every functioning receiver in Valkyrie space. And it was cold and hard as the void between stars. 1 year ago, you murdered 890 million of my people. You killed our children and poisoned our worlds. And you did this because you believed we were weak. She paused and let the silence stretch, and when she spoke again, her words would be remembered for 1,000 years. You thought us weak because we wept for our dead, she continued. You were wrong. We did not weep from weakness. We wept because we knew what we would have to become. We wept for the mercy we would have to abandon, and now the time for tears has ended. Across the bridge, her crew stood ready at their stations, and every face was hard with purpose, and every hand was steady with resolve. Now witness what humanity looks like when it stops being kind, Admiral Tanaka declared, and the words fell like a death sentence upon the Volturi Dominion. The Battle of the Crimson Nebula began with humanity's fleet advancing in perfect formation. And the Valkyrie ships tried to respond, but their communications were dead, and their commanders could not coordinate. And what should have been a defensive formation became a chaotic scramble as each captain made their own desperate decisions. Human weapons spoke with voices of fire, and Valkyrie ships exploded one after another like stars being born and dying in the same moment. And the nebula itself seemed to burn as the battle raged through its crimson clouds. The Empress watched from her flagship as her mighty fleet was systematically torn apart. And she screamed orders that no one could hear and demanded reports that no one could send. And for the first time in her 200-year life, she felt something she had never known before. True and absolute terror. Her flagship shields fell under the combined assault of a dozen human vessels. And the divine vengeance shuddered as weapons tore through its hull. And the Empress was thrown from her throne as explosions ripped through her beautiful ship. Surrender, came Admiral Tanaka's voice through the chaos. Surrender and you will live to face justice. The Empress had never surrendered to anyone in her life, and her pride screamed at her to fight to the death. But she looked around at her burning bridge and her dying crew, and she knew that pride meant nothing against this implacable enemy. I surrender, she whispered, and those 2 words cost her more than all the treasures of her empire. The battle ended with the Valkyrie fleet in ruins, and humanity had not lost a single major vessel. For their year of preparation had given them every advantage, and the element of surprise had been total and devastating. Admiral Tanaka accepted the Empress's surrender with no emotion showing on her face, and she gave orders for the prisoners to be treated with dignity. For humanity was not like the Valkyrie and would not become monsters even in victory. But the war was not over. It had only begun. For humanity had not come simply to defeat the Valkyrie. They had come for something far more complete. And the word for what they intended was a word that would make the galaxy tremble. Seizure. The Valkyrie had started this war with murder, and humanity would end it by taking everything the Dominion had ever built or owned or loved. And there would be no mercy, and no negotiation, and no second chances. For humanity had learned that kindness to monsters only breeds more monsters. 18 months had passed since the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, and humanity had not stopped at victory, for victory was merely the beginning of something far larger. And the word that echoed through every corner of the former Valkyrie Dominion was a word that meant the end of everything they had ever known. Seizure. Human soldiers marched across Valkyrie worlds like an unstoppable tide. And they did not simply occupy these planets. They claimed them completely and absolutely. And every military installation was captured or destroyed until not a single weapon remained in Valkyrie hands. The once proud Valkyrie fleet, which had numbered in the thousands, was reduced to nothing but scrap metal and debris floating in the void. And the shipyards that had built these vessels for 10,000 years were dismantled piece by piece, and humans rebuilt them to serve humanity's purposes instead. Commander Okonkwo led the ground forces that took the Velthari homeworld, and his soldiers moved through the ancient cities with discipline and purpose. And they encountered resistance from those who would rather die than submit. But even the bravest Velthari warriors could not stand against the cold fury of humanity's vengeance. "Secure every building," Okonkwo ordered his troops. "Document everything, miss nothing, for we are not here to destroy but to claim, and what we claim we keep forever." The economic seizure was perhaps even more devastating than the military conquest, for human corporations now controlled every aspect of Velthari commerce, and the Dominion's ancient currency became worthless overnight as humanity's credit became the only money that could buy food or fuel or shelter. Factories that had produced goods for Velthari consumers now produced goods for human markets. And farms that had fed Velthari families now grew crops that were shipped to human colonies. And the wealth that had accumulated over 10,000 years of conquest flowed into human hands like water finding its natural level. The Velthari people found themselves working in their own factories and fields, not as owners, but as laborers. And human overseers watched their every move and ensured that production quotas were met. And there was no cruelty in this treatment, but there was no kindness either. For humanity had learned that kindness was wasted on those who mistook it for weakness. Chancellor Webb stood before the Galactic Concord to announce what humanity had done, and every ambassador from every species watched with mixtures of fear and admiration as he spoke. "Let the record show that humanity did not seek this war," Webb declared, and his voice carried through the great chamber with the weight of absolute certainty. "We extended friendship and received murder in return. We offered trade and received poison in return. And we were forced to become what we never wanted to be." He paused and looked around at the assembled representatives, and many of them could not meet his eyes. "The Velthari Dominion attacked us without provocation and without mercy," he continued. "They planned to exterminate our entire species as if we were insects to be crushed beneath their feet. And so we have responded not with mercy, but with consequence." The chamber was silent as death as the Chancellor spoke his final words. "The Velthari Dominion no longer exists," Webb announced, and his voice was calm and final. "Its worlds and resources and people now belong to the United Earth Protectorate. This is not conquest motivated by greed. This is consequence delivered by justice. And let every species in this concord remember what happens when you raise your hand against humanity." Several ambassadors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and quiet conversations began in corners and corridors as species reconsidered their relationships with these terrifying humans. The political seizure was completed when Empress Syraketh and her entire high command were brought before a human military tribunal, and they stood in chains in a courtroom that was broadcast to every corner of the galaxy, and the evidence of their crimes was presented for all to see. Images of burned worlds and mass graves appeared on screens, and recordings of Velthari commanders laughing as they ordered the deployment of biological weapons played for billions of viewers. And the defense attorneys could offer nothing but silence because there was no defense for what had been done. The Empress stood tall even in her chains, and her pride had not entirely abandoned her. But when the verdict was read, she finally understood that her ancient empire had ended forever. "Guilty of crimes against humanity," the judge declared. "Guilty of genocide and the use of prohibited weapons. Guilty of planning the extermination of an entire sentient species. And the sentence is imprisonment for the remainder of natural life on the frozen moon designated Eco 7. The Empress was taken away in silence, and she would spend the rest of her very long life in a cell of ice and stone, watching through a small window as human ships passed overhead. And she would have centuries to consider the folly of attacking a species that did not know how to surrender. But the final seizure the one that would echo through generations, was the cultural transformation that humanity imposed upon the Velthari people. Human administrators took control of Velthari education, and history books were rewritten to tell the truth about the Dominion's 10,000 years of cruelty and conquest. And young Velthari learned that their ancestors had been villains rather than heroes, that their empire had been built on blood and suffering rather than glory. Monuments to Velthari conquests were torn down across every world, and in their place rose memorials to the victims of Velthari aggression. And the names of 890 million murdered humans were carved in stone where statues of emperors had once stood. On the Velthari homeworld, which humanity renamed Memorial, human settlers began to arrive. And they built homes and schools and parks where Velthari palaces had once loomed. And the children of the murdered colonists played in gardens that grew over the ruins of empire. A young human girl named Elena, whose grandmother had died on New Eden, stood before one of the great memorial walls and traced the carved names with her small fingers. And a Velthari worker paused in his labor to watch her with eyes that held no hatred, but only a deep and weary sadness. "So many names," Elena said softly, and she was too young to understand the full weight of what she was seeing. The Velthari worker nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and heavy with shame. "We did this," he said, and the admission cost him more than the child could know. "My people did this, and now we must live with what we have done." Elena looked up at him with the innocent curiosity of childhood, and she asked a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you hurt so many people?" The worker had no answer that could satisfy that question, for there was no answer that could ever make sense of such senseless cruelty. And he returned to his labor with tears he could not explain falling from his ancient eyes. This was the complete seizure that humanity had achieved, not just land and resources and power, but the very soul of the Velthari people, taken and reshaped and rebuilt in the image of justice and consequence. And the galaxy would never forget what they had witnessed. 5 years had passed since the end of the war, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. For humanity had risen from tragedy to become one of the most powerful forces in known space. And every species watched them with a mixture of respect and carefully hidden fear. The former Velthari territories, now fully integrated into the United Earth Protectorate, had made humanity incredibly wealthy, for these worlds were rich in resources and strategic value. And the trade routes that had once served the Dominion now served human interests instead. But victory had not come without cost, and those who had fought the war carried scars that would never fully heal. And the question of what humanity had become haunted the minds of those who had made the hardest choices. Admiral Yuki Tanaka retired from military service on the 5th anniversary of the war's end, and she stood before her fleet one last time to bid farewell to the men and women she had led through the fires of vengeance. "We did what was necessary," she told them, and her voice was softer now than it had been during the war. "We protected our species, and we delivered justice to those who wronged us. But necessity is a heavy burden to carry, and I have carried it long enough." She founded the Tanaka Foundation with her retirement, and this organization built hospitals and schools on former Velthari worlds, not out of guilt, but out of hope. For she believed that healing had to follow justice if the cycle of hatred was ever to end. "We showed them what we could become when pushed," she said at the Foundation's opening ceremony. "Now we must show them what we choose to be when the fighting is done." Commander Elias Okonkwo took a different path, for he had seen the faces of young Velthari who had been born after the war and knew nothing of their ancestors' crimes. And he believed that punishing children for the sins of their grandparents was not justice but cruelty. He established programs to integrate young Velthari into human society, and he spoke in schools and community centers about the importance of moving forward without forgetting the past. and many humans thought him too soft, while many Velthari thought him an agent of their conquerors. But he continued his work regardless. Hate is easy, Okonkwo often said. Understanding is hard. But understanding is what separates civilization from savagery. And we did not survive this war just to become the next Velthari Dominion. Chancellor Webb faced challenges of a different kind. For humanity's victory had awakened appetites that worried him deeply. And voices rose demanding that humanity expand further and take more and use their power to dominate the galaxy. We are the strongest now, these voices cried. Why should we limit ourselves when we could have everything? Webb addressed these demands in a speech that would define the next era of human civilization, and he stood before the council with the weight of history on his shoulders. I understand the temptation, he admitted. We have tasted power and found it sweet. We have proven that no one can stand against us. And there are those who say we should use this strength to ensure that no one ever threatens us again. He paused and looked out at the representatives who held the future in their hands. But I ask you to remember why we fought this war, Webb continued. We did not fight because we wanted power. We fought because our children were murdered. We fought for justice and survival, not conquest and domination. And if we forget that difference, we become exactly what we destroyed. His words were met with mixed reactions. But they carried enough weight to guide humanity away from the path of empire, at least for now. And Webb retired, knowing that he had done what he could to preserve humanity's soul. On the world called Memorial, a young Velthari named Ketharan sat in his small room and wrote an application that would change his life. For he wanted to join the Human Naval Academy and serve the species that had conquered his people. His family had called him a traitor, and his neighbors had called him a fool. But Ketharan had been born 5 years after the war and had grown up learning the truth about what his ancestors had done. And he carried a weight of inherited shame that he desperately wanted to transform into something better. My ancestors brought ruin upon their own people through arrogance and cruelty, he wrote in his application essay. They murdered innocent millions and dreamed of genocide, and they were rightfully punished for their crimes. And I do not seek to excuse or justify what they did. His hands trembled as he continued, for these words were the hardest he had ever written. I wish to serve the species that taught us, harshly but truthfully, that actions have consequences, Kethar wrote. I wish to prove that not all Velthari are monsters, that we can learn and grow and become better than what we were. And I will spend my life earning the trust that my ancestors threw away. The Academy received many applications that year, but the review board paid special attention to this one. And after long deliberation, they made a decision that would echo through history. Ketharan was accepted. When he arrived at the Academy, many human cadets looked at him with suspicion and even hatred. For the wounds of war had not fully healed. But he endured their hostility with patience and proved himself through excellence. And slowly, grudgingly, some began to accept him. Years later, Lieutenant Commander Keth Orm would stand on the bridge of a human starship, the first Velthari officer in history, and he would carry the hope of 2 species on his shoulders. The final scene of this great drama played out in a quiet diplomatic reception, where a Concord ambassador approached a human diplomat with a question that had been burning in her mind for years. How should we understand your species? The ambassador asked, and her 4 eyes blinked with genuine curiosity. I have watched you show mercy to your enemies' children while building monuments to your dead. I have seen you destroy without hesitation and heal without expectation of reward. So tell me, are you merciful or merciless? The human diplomat smiled, and it was a smile that contained all the complexity of humanity's strange and wonderful nature. Yes, she answered simply, and she walked away before the ambassador could ask what that meant. Across the galaxy, species began updating their diplomatic protocols regarding humanity. And the new classification spread from world to world and government to government. And it read, Threat level: existential if provoked. Recommended approach: do not provoke. And so the war that began with murder and proceeded through vengeance ended with a galaxy forever changed. And humanity stood among the stars as neither conquerors nor victims, but as something far more complicated and far more interesting. They were the species that wept for their dead and then destroyed those who made them weep. The species that built hospitals on the worlds they had conquered. The species that accepted the children of their enemies into their own ranks. And the species that answered a simple question about mercy with a smile and a single word. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said about humanity. They are species of contradictions, capable of the greatest kindness and the most terrible violence. And the difference between the two lies not in their nature, but in how they are treated. The Velthari chose to treat them as prey, and they learned too late that humanity was never prey at all.